how I can write LINQ query to get the list of students. Now I'm going to use the LINQ query in order to get the list of students. So let's focus now how we can create LINQ query in order to do data manipulation or to retrieve data from the database. The first thing, I will open the parentheses, and inside these parentheses I have to use the keyword from. Then I have to mention my object name. Let's say student obj, and then the keyword in, and then I have to say application context, which is defined here, dot my entity name student or students, and then go enter, and then say I want to select, either you can select the whole object or part of it. For now let's select the whole object, like student obj, student obj. But still, till now, this will not work. Why? Because here we said we need to return list of students. How we can say that, okay, this query will return list of rows? We have to say dot to list async or to list. For now, let's focus on this, to list. So now it works. So now we have list of students by this way, using the LINQ query. From my object name, I can name it as I want, and then my application context dot the entity name, I can say select the whole object, or I can select part of this object. And if you want to select part of this object, you can simply do like here, select the object dot, and then select your property like the student ID, the student name, status, etc. But for now I will select the whole object. Then I can simply say return student lst. So now this method will return the list of students from the database using Entity Framework and LINQ query. And as we explained how we can handle the exceptions in C# using try and catch by this way, exception EX. This is exactly what we explained in the C# session. So I will take this here, try this, and if something went wrong, what I want to do, I will return first of all null. And also I can use the exception here in order to save the log into the database, or to show to pass a message for the user, or whatever you want. How we can do that? For example, let's define string error message equal ex dot message simply, or you can take the stack trace and pass it to the user or to the database, or whatever you are going to do with. Or inside the inner exception, you can go inside this inner exception and take the message, or take the inner exception itself, or whatever you want to take from these objects. For now, we are not going to do anything with this exception, but this is how we can implement the try and catch in C#. Let's go now to the next method, which is add student. Again, how we can use the Entity Framework and LINQ to add a new student to the database. Simply, I can say my application context, which is defined at the top of this class, dot my entity name student dot, simply I can say add, and inside this add, I can say please add a new student, and these are the properties. Like the student address will be equal to something like address, and then comma, and also the student age I need to add like 10, comma, student ID is identity, so I don't want to include it here. And the student name, we can say the student name is like John, and the last one is the student status equal to true. And then I have to end this line by semicolon. So by this way I can add a student, or there is another way. I can define here object of type student, call it for example student equal new student, and this object I can say student dot student status equal true, and the student object dot name equal John, and student dot age equal 10, and student dot address equal address. And simply I can take this object and place it here by this way. You can do this or that as you want. For now I will use the first way, and I will remove this object. Okay, so now we have said that we need to add new students to our database, but as I explained in the entity framework session, we have to call the method save changes in order to reflect the changes to the database. So after saying add, I need to say my application context dot save changes. Now this will be reflected to the database, and the new student will be added to the database. Now let's go to the third method, which is delete. How I can delete an existing student? In order to delete one student, I need to know the student ID. So logically, this method should receive a student ID. So we will say here that this method should receive integer ID. But as we are in this class, and this class just implement this interface, so first of all we have to edit this in order to say that this function should receive integer ID. So this will work now. Using this ID, I can delete the student. Same way, I will use the application DB context dot my entity name students dot remove, and I have to mention the student which I am going to delete or remove. So first I can say that here student std equal, again I will use the LINQ to get the student which I'm going to remove. So from like student obj in my application DB context dot the entity name student select the whole object, for example student object. But for this I'm saying that I need just one student, so I can use here dot first or default in order to get only one student. But actually this is not enough, because here we are saying select the first student from the table without mentioning that we need the student with the ID this value. So how we can add a condition to our LINQ query? Simply before saying select, I have to say where my object student obj dot the ID will be equal to the value ID. So by this way, I said that I need only the student with the same ID. And if there is more than one student with the same ID, I will get the first. It is not logical to have two students with the same ID, but in case, so this query will return the first student. And then I have to say that this std I need to remove. Simple like that. And after that I have to say save changes. Application context does save changes. So now we have three methods to get the students and to add a new student and to delete an existing student. Okay, this is in the student repository. I will close this interface and I will go back to the controller. Inside the index, I need to retrieve the students. How I can do that? So here, I need to have a reference for this interface, student repository. I will say private read only again student repository for example, and just give it like this underscore. This is not defined. I will say using the project.repository. So now I have a reference to this interface. And also I can use this interface inside my constructor. So in order to set the value of this repository, I have to create a constructor for my controller. So public student controller, and this will receive again student repository and just give it student repository. And inside this constructor, I will say this need to be as this value. Okay, here there is a problem like accessibility parameter type student repository is less accessible than method student. Okay, fine. This means that my interface is not a public. So I have to go to my interface here and say that this is public. Now go to the student controller, it works now. So now here we are saying that this controller will receive this interface as a parameter once the student controller has been instantiated. How this will be passed? This will be passed using the dependency injection, as the dependency injection is a part of the .NET Core. So how we can pass an instance of the student repository? I will go to startup again, and here after these services I will say services dot add transient. For now I will use transient. Transient mean that a new object will be created every time for this class. We have another options like add scope. Add scope means that the dependency injection will create a new object of the class per request. And also we have another one which is add singleton. Singleton means that only one object will be created for the whole life cycle or for the whole project. But for now I will use the services add transient, and inside this transient I will mention that student repository and student repository. So by this way, I said that the dependency injection will take care about creating the objects of the student repository. Let's close this one and go back. So now here I can say that student repository, this one, dot add student or get all students. For this method I will use get all students. What I can do with this result, let's take this as list of students and I need to add model like student lst equal this. So this, what I can do with this, how I can, for example, render this list of students to the end user. Simply I can send it with the view by this way. So by this way I'm saying that the result of this index action method will be a view with list of students, and we will see how we can deal with the list of students inside the view. Now let's create another action method. I will go and I will say public, let's keep it action result, and for example create a new student, and this should receive student object like std, for instance, because if we want to create a student, so we need the information about that student. So this method or this action method should receive data of type student, and this will return also a view. But after creating this student, which view I want to return? Like I want to return the index in order to list all students. So I can say that this will return the index view. And what I can do inside this, I will simply say application, or sorry, repository, my repository, student repository, or iStudent repository dot add student, and I have to pass something. So now we forget to say here inside our repository, like add student, we said add student by this way, but in the real life we need to say that this method should receive the information about the student. So we need to go again to the interface and edit this in order to receive student or std, and I will close it. I will go back to this and say student std, and I will remove this and say std. Just simply add this std. I will go back to the controller now and I will pass the std here. So this is the way of how we can create a new resource in the database, and if you remember, this should be a post method. So we can say that this is post, http post, and we can say that this is http get. Okay, so this will be applied when the user wants to create a new resource or a new student. But where is the page where the end user can write the student information like the address, the name, the age, and then will create the student? So we need another page in order to render it for the end user, so he can create or he can enter the student information. So we need another action method here, like action result, called also create, but without receiving any parameters. And this create and create here have the same name but different parameters. And this is what we said in the object-oriented programming, the overloading. And this will return its view. Now let's make sure that there is a view. Go to view, there is no view, so I can simply say add view and razor view, and let's call it create. That's it. So the view for this action method has been created. Now let's create another action method for deleting an existing student, like public action result. Let's call it delete, and as we said, this should receive integer ID for the student ID. And then I can say student repository dot delete, and I have to pass this ID. That's it. And then return view, and which view we need to return the index, because after deleting the student there is no view to return, so we can return the index. Sorry, here it's action, not action result. So now we have the index, and this is the first or the default action method, and it will return list of students, and we need to work with its view in order to render the list of students on the browser. And we have the create action method. This should be a get, http get method, because this only will return the view in order to allow the users to enter the information, the student information. And then the end user will click on create, and this will call this action method, which is post, and the student information will be passed as an object here. And then after creating the student, we will return the index view. And for the delete also, it will receive the student ID, and then we will delete this student and will return also the index view. And also, as we said, we have a model here for the student courses. So every student will register in a course or more than one course. So we need here also in the student controller to have an action method to do the registration process. So I will have public action result register, and for the registration, what I need to pass here, I need to know the course ID, integer course ID, and also I need to pass the student ID, integer student ID, because here in the student courses we said that we have the ID course, and this also will be a primary key, so we will say that this is a primary key. And also this will be auto generated, database generated. I need to add the schema here, and I have to mention that this is identity, and this is foreign key, and this is also foreign key. So I need to insert the student ID, and I need to insert the course ID. So back to the student controller. Here, how I can now add a registration for the student. First of all, we need to add the function in the iStudent repository. I will go here and I will say public void register. And this method should receive integer course ID and another integer for the student ID. And I will go back to the repository, student repository, and I will say implement. So this method will be added here. I will remove this and I will say that I need to add a new registration. My application db context dot student courses dot add new student courses with these parameters. The first parameter should be the course ID will be the course ID value, and also the student ID will be the student ID from here, and I will end this line by semicolon, and then I have to say my application context dot save changes. That's it. Go back to the controller and here I will say the student repository dot register, and I will pass the course ID and also I will pass the student ID. And this method will return another view, like view of index. That's it. So now we added the necessary methods or action methods inside the student controller.